But I was so mesmerized, I just remember the girl. And she takes a piece of paper and she's writing something on it, Post-it. She turns it around and she pushes it to me and said, "Please say yes."
I remember that.
It was so sweet.
There are some people who don't just act in films. They linger in your memory long after the credits roll. Not because they demanded attention, but because they never needed to. Richard Gere was one of those rare figures. He didn't shout to be seen, didn't chase the spotlight the way so many around him did. And yet for decades, he stood at the center of Hollywood, effortlessly commanding attention with nothing more than a quiet glance or a subtle shift in expression. You might remember him from Pretty Woman, where charm felt natural rather than performed, or from An Officer and a Gentleman, where strength and vulnerability existed side by side in a way that felt deeply human. He became a symbol of something rare in cinema, a man who could be powerful without being loud, captivating without trying too hard. But then, something unusual happened. At a time when most actors cling tightly to fame, when they fight to stay relevant in an industry that forgets quickly, he did the opposite. He stepped back. Not gradually, not accidentally, but deliberately. Offers were still coming. The spotlight hadn't faded, yet he chose distance. For many, it didn't make sense. Why would someone at the height of success walk away from everything others spend their entire lives chasing? Was it pressure? Was it controversy? Or was it something much deeper, something internal that had been quietly growing for years? To understand that decision, you have to go back long before the fame, before the premieres and the applause, to a quieter beginning. Richard Gere was born in 1949 in Philadelphia, growing up in a modest, structured household that valued discipline and simplicity. There was nothing flashy about his early life, no signs that he would one day become a global icon. But even as a child, there was a sense of introspection about him, a tendency to observe rather than dominate. He wasn't just focused on one thing, he explored many. Music became an early language for him. He learned instruments, wrote compositions, and developed a sensitivity that would later define his performances. At the same time, he pushed himself physically, excelling in sports that required precision and control. That combination, emotional awareness and discipline, would shape everything that came after. When he eventually enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, he chose to study philosophy, not acting, not fame, philosophy. Even then, he seemed more interested in understanding life than performing it. But something pulled him away from that path. After 2 years, he made a decision that didn't align with expectations. He left college behind, choosing uncertainty over security, and stepped into the world of performance. His early years weren't glamorous. Theater became his training ground, a place where he could experiment, fail, and grow without the pressure of cameras. One of his earliest breakthroughs came when he performed in the stage production of Grease in London. It wasn't just about talent, it was about presence. There was something about the way he carried himself that drew people in. He didn't overact. He didn't force emotion. He allowed silence to speak, and that became his signature. As he transitioned into film, that same quality set him apart. In Days of Heaven, directed by Terrence Malick, and he proved that dialogue wasn't necessary to leave an impression. The film moved slowly, almost poetically, and Gere fit perfectly into that rhythm. He wasn't just acting, he was existing within the frame. Audiences began to notice. Then came American Gigolo, the role that changed everything. It was bold, controversial, and unlike anything audiences had seen before. Gere's portrayal redefined the idea of a leading man. He wasn't just attractive, He was layered, mysterious, and emotionally complex. That role didn't just make him famous, it made him unforgettable. By the early 1980s, his career reached another level with An Officer and a Gentleman. The film resonated deeply with audiences, not because it followed a formula, but because it felt real. His character wasn't perfect. He struggled, resisted change, and slowly evolved. Unto that authenticity made the story powerful, and Gere became something more than a star. He became a symbol of emotional depth in an era that often prioritized spectacle. And then a few years later came the film that would define him for an entire generation, Pretty Woman. Alongside Julia Roberts, he created a dynamic that felt effortless. Their chemistry wasn't forced. It wasn't exaggerated. It felt natural, almost accidental, which made it all the more captivating. The film's success was massive, but what truly mattered was how it connected with people. It wasn't just a love story, it was a moment in time that audiences carried with them. Throughout the following years, Gere continued to evolve. He took on roles that reflected maturity, depth, and a willingness to explore different aspects of human experience. In Chicago, and he showcased a completely different side of himself, blending charisma with performance in a way that earned him widespread recognition. In Arbitrage, he portrayed a man caught between ambition and morality, reminding audiences that his strength as an actor had never faded. But while his career remained strong, something else was happening beneath the surface. Fame for many becomes an identity. For Gere, it seemed to be something separate, something he never fully attached himself to. Over time, his focus began to shift. He became more introspective, more drawn toward understanding life beyond the surface level. His interest in spirituality, particularly Buddhism, wasn't a phase. It became a central part of who he was. That internal shift began to influence his external choices. He became more selective with roles and more distant from the constant noise of Hollywood. And then came a moment that would quietly alter the course of his career. During the Academy Awards 1993, Gere stepped away from the script and spoke openly about political issues, specifically addressing the situation in Tibet and calling out leadership in China. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was simply something he felt compelled to say. The reaction was immediate and lasting. While no official statement defined the consequences, the impact was clear. Opportunities shifted. Major studios became hesitant. His presence in mainstream Hollywood began to fade, not because of a lack of talent, but because of the stance he had taken. In an industry deeply connected to global markets, especially China, his words carried weight. But what's most interesting is how he responded. He didn't fight back publicly. He didn't try to reclaim his position. Instead, he leaned further into the life he had already been moving toward. He focused on smaller, independent projects, roles that allowed him to explore meaning rather than chase success. Films like Time Out of Mind reflected that shift, quiet, introspective, and deeply human. Outside of acting, his humanitarian work became more prominent. Through the Gere Foundation, he supported causes related to human rights, health, and global aid. But even here, he remained consistent with who he had always been. He didn't seek attention for it. He didn't turn it into a public identity. It was simply something he believed in. His personal life followed a similar pattern, complex, evolving, and often misunderstood from the outside. Relationships came and went, and each reflecting a different phase of his journey. His marriage to Cindy Crawford captured global attention, representing a moment where fame and image seemed perfectly aligned. But behind that image were two individuals growing in different directions, eventually choosing to part ways without drama. Later, his relationship with Carey Lowell brought a sense of stability, a quieter life away from constant scrutiny. Yet even that, after many years, came to an end, not because of conflict, but because of change. And eventually, he found something different with Alejandra Silva, a partnership rooted less in image and more in shared values and understanding. By the time he entered his later years, Gere had become something rare, not just in Hollywood, but in life. Someone who had experienced immense success and willingly stepped away from it, and not out of failure, but out of choice. He redefined what it means to have a legacy. It wasn't about staying at the top, it was about knowing when to leave it behind. Today, his life looks very different from what people might expect. Quieter, more grounded, focused on family, on meaningful work, on living with intention rather than chasing recognition. And perhaps that's what makes his story so compelling. Not the fame, not the films, but the decision to walk away from it all and still remain complete. Because in the end, Richard Gere didn't disappear. He simply chose a different way to exist.